Hi, Dr. Lauren Kosinski back again on Wednesday, February 7th, and today is day number 11 of my 30, we'll call it 33-day video challenge. And so the short answer to what I did when my parachute failed to open and my credible holding position didn't materialize was that I cut bait. And it took me a while to do this because I was having trouble really assessing the consequences of a decision and how I would present this to another place. I didn't really want to say anything derogatory about where I was, but in some ways I kind of had to in order to say where I was going. And I guess I want to say again that overall my feeling in this time was of sort of looking in a funhouse mirror, because there had been distortions I'd been managing from the person who was my supervisor at the previous place. I didn't know how much the CMO and my chairman were involved in the plan for how to manage my time in the last year of my contract. My chairman was supportive. I think he would have liked to see me stay at that program, but he couldn't see a way to make that. I was more expendable. So that too is a hard thing to try to manage. It made sense to me, and on some level I didn't take it personally. But on another level, it's really hard not to be affected by these things when they're happening. So the way that I approached finding another opportunity was that it still made sense to me to be in New York. So I decided to try to speak to the chairs of other surgery departments in other area hospitals. And there are a lot of good ones in New York and people who are progressive thinkers. But I had, through another surgeon acquaintance who had visited the institution where I had been, learned about the chair of a department who sounded particularly sharp and innovative in his approach to things. And in fact, he had innovated a surgical procedure fairly early on in his career. And I looked at some YouTube talks and things like that to try to learn a little bit more about him. And then I approached him with my proposal. So much to my surprise, he challenged me a lot on the proposal to try to make a unit of care that I had described, a concierge unit of care built on these holistic medicine principles, because he didn't have much faith that there was a way to make hospitals work, frankly. He thought the answer was to try to get people out of the hospital. And he knew data, like he knew an interesting thing that I didn't, that people assign greater expertise to their physicians if the public bathrooms are clean in a hospital. But being in an Upper East Side fancy hospital, he told me that he'd gone so far with certain VIP patients to iron the New York Times for them in the morning. Now, it creates an interesting visual. But he said all of those efforts that you make, the walnut paneled rooms, the Scottish salmon brought in from nearby restaurants, the papers of your choice in your room in the morning, all of that can unravel if somebody has a bad experience down in the radiology department. And, you know, just being cold and waiting in the radiology department, much less dealing with an unpleasant person, could be enough to do that. So I could see where he was coming from, but he asked me to come back with some more data about things and to meet again. And I left that meeting feeling a little crushed about his disbelief in my project, but at the same time, he'd invited me back. This is a busy guy. So when I went back, we had a kind of a different conversation. And the upshot of that conversation, I will always remember, he said, you know, you're not really like other surgeons. You're kind of almost more like a preacher. And I thought, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the upshot was that he wanted to ask me to create a position as vice chair of surgery in charge of professionalism. And as this role evolved, I was to deal not just with the surgeons, but also with their staff, because there was a vice chair, an administrative vice chair in the department who was concerned about relationships between surgeons and their staff. So this was a big job because this was a regional institution. There were something like 400 surgeons in the system. That meant 400 staff. And my proposal, plus there was nothing like this that existed, so I had to make something up. And I hadn't had, while I'd been thinking about things for a long time and thinking about my critique of the disruptive physician and what that meant and how we were framing that conversation and what the politics were that were driving a lot of that, I didn't have a list of remedies. And so it was going to be necessary to make some kind of a proposal. Although really that didn't even come at the start of this. What came at the start of this was to tell him what I wanted for a salary and kind of what the job would look like. And then he wanted me to go and meet the chairs of the other institutions. So I remember before going to those meetings, talking to him about what he advised me to accomplish in them. And he talked to me a little bit about the different personalities involved, but basically this was just get to know people, not have to sell them on the idea particularly. And so I thought this was in his department in a way, which might have been naive, but it was his idea. I mean, I was being invited into something. Now, the problem with this as it emerged over time was that I wanted to be clinically active because it felt completely important to me to be relevant to the people that I was working with. I wanted to be in the trenches with them, working in the operating room next to them, but I didn't want to be 100% responsible for generating my revenue. Starting a new practice in a competitive environment in New York was not a small thing. That's a more than full-time job by itself. So that was one hitch. And then there were some other hitches along the way that had to do with ideas about whether a surgeon could lead an initiative like this. So was it credible in that way? Why not have a psychologist or somebody else do something like this? And also in the end, sort of an idea that this concept was a little bit ahead of its time. Not really, though. This concept was right on time. And I did have some ideas, and I partnered with somebody who had been doing physician engagement work for a while, who I'd met through a narrative medicine conference, to begin to talk with somebody who'd been doing that work for a while to just have some help with putting together a proposal. So that was how I did it. I should say that in these weeks while I was sorting out what the heck was going on at the institution where I was supposed to be, it didn't stop me from being interested in my project or for working on it. I mean, I had things to read and to think about every day, but I didn't have the door opener that I wanted by having an affiliation with an institution where I could say, here's what I'm working on, here's who I am, and not just be like kind of a disenfranchised surgeon who was on the street looking to explore something that was still pretty novel. So that was how I approached things. And yes, as with everything, there were twists and turns in the road and other challenges to meet, but it was really validating. I did go on these interviews. I did not pursue the other jobs, which was probably a mistake. And I wouldn't have avoided those had that all cohered a little better in terms of logistics and in my personal life, but also because I'd been invited to create this other job by a powerful person. And so to me, that meant that the likelihood of that succeeding was basically over 95%. And so I thought I had a bird in the hand. So my question for you would be, how would you approach the failure of a plan that you've made or had in place? How would you have tried to solve the problem of generating a new opportunity? Would you have retreated into what you know? Would you go on to try, as I did, to identify some other places? Maybe that's a little bit hard because it's abstract. And maybe also to think some about that funhouse mirror, how difficult it is. Like in retrospect too, I think my chairman at my prior institution, for example, probably could have helped me think about that some more and problem solve some more, because he was available and did want to see me find a good place and do even my weird but interesting and kind of necessary work. And I was so unsure in a certain way about who were allies and who weren't that I didn't know how to be vulnerable to some people that might have still helped me. Now, there were other people, though, that I would say I was vulnerable to, who I think over time it became clear were not helpers. So, I mean, the cheese stands alone, I guess. It's always hard to know where you stand. And so the best position that I could find was one that was true to myself. I'll see you in the next video.